Our next presentation is from a research associate from University College in London. Give a warm round of applause for Dr. Julia Shaw.
Hello. I get an old school microphone, which means I can play with my voice more. I always feel a bit like a stand-up comedian when I get one of these. Apparently my head is too small. One more reason why we need more women in tech. I'm Dr. Julia Shaw, and I study memory. I study memory in humans, mostly, and I'm here to teach you a bit about how flexible your memory can be, and the kinds of things you should be safeguarding yourself against, and also, possibly, how technology and artificial intelligence can help. So, let's start with the basics. Memories are neurons. They're really a collection of neurons, networks of neurons. We hear this term in artificial intelligence, and we hear it in memory science. Neural networks. When we create a memory, what are we doing? We're creating associations between neurons in the brain, neurons that store, and clusters of neurons that store the different things that we're experiencing. So of particular interest to me are what are called autobiographical memories, memories about your life. So memories about events, experiences, memories that form part of your identity that I would argue make you who you are. So these memories, especially when we're talking about networks of them, also help explain why when we experience something and we have what's called a multi-sensory experience. So as you're sitting here, you are maybe needing some coffee, you're experiencing the temperature, you can feel the seat underneath your chair, you can feel your bum on the chair, you're smelling, you're hearing, you're tasting, you're feeling things. That's multisensory. Now, in the brain, what does that actually look like? If I ask people, where do you think memories live in the brain? Some people will say, oh, I know the answer to that. I know. They're in the hippocampus, which is a good start, which is part of the answer. Memories do start in the hippocampus, and there's actually some groundbreaking research that was conducted this year that's challenging our notions of the role we think the hippocampus plays. But the hippocampus is a structure that supposedly looks a bit like a seahorse that lives somewhere near the middle of your brain. And the idea is actually what happens is that your experiences come in, and it relays out the networks. So essentially, your short-term memories live there, but long-term memories live as more complex networks throughout different parts of the brain. So the hippocampus is involved, but only for a short period of time. And the reason why when you go home and you think about that talk about memory, and you think about where you were sitting and where you were in CEBIT and how wonderful the exhibits were and how inspiring it all was, you are activating different parts of the brain. You're not just activating a fact. You're not just activating the fact, I went to CEBIT. You have emotions and other things associated with that. And all of the different bits that you're recalling will activate the parts of the brain that are responsible for those things. So if you're hearing things, a part of the brain that's associated with hearing things is activated as part of the neural network that's responsible for that memory. Now, why does that matter? For one, it's dispelling the idea that memories live in one part of the brain, because they don't. They live as complex networks across the brain. Now we're to networks. Big networks, complicated networks. Networks that are really difficult to understand. But we can mess with these networks. And we have done some, memory scientists, I'm not going to claim the entire field, memory scientists have done some phenomenal things when it comes to networks of memories. For example, they have exposed mice to specific situations. They've let those mice sleep with having electrodes in their brains that have recorded the memories that they were creating while they were running around. And they shocked them. And there's a room where they got shocked. The mice went to sleep. When you sleep, you actually often rehearse. Essentially, your brain automatically goes over those networks, those memories that you were forming during the day. One reason why sleep is really important. But what also can happen is that scientists can go into these brains of mice And because they can see when that exact network is being activated, because they monitored the mouse's memory as it was running around in real time, they can delete it. They can erase that mouse's memory by interrupting the connections between neurons in that memory. This is where the networks become really important. You can delete pieces, you can delete the connections, and you delete the memory. You're not getting rid of brain cells, you're getting rid of connections. For false memories, which is what I study, this stuff gets even bigger. Memories as reality. So again, I touched on this idea that memories, autobiographical memories, I find particularly interesting because I think they really make us who we are. They are the foundations, I think, of our identity. But even more so, what happens when that memory isn't quite real? Who here has seen Blade Runner? The new one, or the old one, but the new one more precisely. If you haven't, let me catch you up a bit on one scene in particular. Can you see this? Maybe. Can we hear it? Tech? There's a video? No? So this is a scene where Blade Runner meets the memory maker. And the memory maker talks about how she creates memories by essentially creating complex emotional scenes that have a lot of detail. What she then does is she implants these memories into replicants. It's fine without sound, it's okay. And so you see her in her lab crafting these complex situations that she then uses and implants into these, you can't really see that at all, that she then implants into these robots to make them feel like they're human. Now, my question to you, I guess, would be, how do you know that your memories are real? How do you know that someone hasn't put them there? Any guesses? I would argue that you don't. You don't know whether people have put memories in your brain, and I would even argue you most of the time can't know. Even in the face of contradictory evidence, we cling to our personal realities, our own stories, the stories of our lives, much more likely than we even accept that that's not possible. I have an aunt who, when you start studying memory and you start writing books and stuff, your family at some point understands what you do. And in my lab, I convince people that they committed crimes that never happened. So I bring participants into the lab. They think that I know lots of information about their lives that I don't actually know. Because I said, I've contacted people you trust ahead of time, and they've told me all these things about you and these experiences that you had. And so I say, and then I start with a true thing. Can you tell me about that? And then I go on to ask them about fake things. Now, in terms of reality checks, though, well, I'll show you a little video about what that actually looks like, because I think it's hard to understand, hard to get what that process can look like in a human being, going from thinking you've never done anything wrong to thinking you maybe committed a crime and assaulted someone with a weapon. We'll also get into why this is important and the ethical implications of all this. So you live in a simulation. My aunt, back to my aunt. My aunt tells this story where she's in Switzerland and she's visiting my aunt's, her kids, and she's, after a wonderful day of sightseeing, she goes into a garage, into a car, and my dad's driving and my mom's in the passenger seat. There's a guy in front of them walking and won't go out of the way. He's obviously unwell. He's talking to himself, and they can't leave this garage. And so my mom gets out of the car and says, sorry, sir, can you please step out of the way? And instead of stepping out of the way, this man runs at her, pushes her into the car, and starts to assault her. Now, my aunt tells this story full of emotion, full of detail. You can practically relive this situation with her. The problem is that she wasn't there. The problem is that this is a true story that happened to my mom, but because my mom was so shaken by this experience, my mom's fine, by the way. Thank you for your consideration. My mom was still so shaken by this experience that she told the family repeatedly about it. And at some point, my aunt felt like this experience was so real and so visceral and so detailed that she must have been there and put herself in the back seat. Now, when you take evidence to my aunt and say, Tante Ilse, I'm half German, Tante Ilse, das kann nicht sein, this is impossible. You weren't even in Switzerland at the time. She goes, no, no, no. I remember it so clearly. Now, this is where I find this really fascinating, is that false memories and real memories feel the same. People think they can identify false memories. So do judges. Not just us about our own memories, but judges and juries and lawyers and therapists often think they will know a false memory if they see one. But they don't, because it's not a lie. It's a reality that you've accepted. And if we look in the brain and we look at what imagination can turn into, imagination, if it's complex enough, if it's multisensory enough, essentially turns into a memory, and it no longer becomes distinguishable. So you live in your personal simulation. Well, that didn't quite work. What does that say? Memory hacker. And so sometimes I call myself the memory hacker, because what I do is I take pieces of information that are real in the brain, I take them out, and I rewire them in a way that never happened to get people to falsely confess to things. Now here's a video that I hope will play better than the last one, showing me in action with participants doing this.
Shaw has designed perhaps the most comprehensive study ever on false memory. She starts by recruiting over 100 people for what they think is a study about their childhood memories.
So this is my first meeting with the participant. The first event which we'll be talking about was the time when you were 12 and you moved from Trinidad to Kelowna. I hated you.
Actually, the study is to see if it's possible to implant a false memory about committing a crime.
I had colleagues saying, this isn't gonna work. There's no way you will get individuals to think that they committed a crime that never happened.
She begins with a true event gathered from their parents. In this case, a family move.
We moved around like every year kind of thing.
But this was just a trick to gain trust. The next step is to introduce the false memory, a fight so severe that the police were called.
So the other event which your parents reported happening was when you were 14 years old, you initiated a physical fight and the police called your parents. They said it happened in Kelowna in the fall. You were with Ryan when it happened?
Only 2 of the details are real. The name of the best friend and the place she lived at the time. The rest is made up.
Honestly, I don't remember. I don't know what you're talking about. I feel like I don't think I've ever been in a fight. I'm so confused.
Shaw then turns to a series of cognitive techniques known to induce false memories, starting with an imagination exercise.
I'd like you to relax, close your eyes, and focus your attention on trying to retrieve this. Okay.
Bolstered with a little social pressure,
This might seem a bit strange, but it does work for most people. Subtly introducing this notion that it works for most people if they try hard enough, which is a subtle form of social manipulation.
and asks the participant to visualize certain details of the stories.
Introducing things that are easy to picture first. Picture yourself at the age of 14. Picture yourself at the age of 14. That's an easy thing to picture. In Kelowna. In Kelowna, the place that she lives, that she lived at the age. Also easy to picture. And it's fall. It's fall. Everybody can picture fall. And you were with Ryan when it happened.
When people imagine events that might have occurred in their past, we know that that's a potent way of creating false memory.
After giving the memory a week to set, she brings the participant back.
Okay, so welcome back. And so by the time we get to interview number 2, we're seeing a different story.
Remember, like a verbal fight, and maybe I seems so unlike, but maybe I pushed or something.
Good, okay. So this is where she's first fully buying into this idea that she's actually had a fight.
I feel like she pushed me first.
Okay. And this person is starting to picture how it could have happened. And what could have been turns into what would have been, turns into what was.
So by the third interview, the memory has taken hold.
I think the cops showed up and we were kind of having maybe a verbal kind of fight, and then it kind of maybe got to a push.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just this once. Shaw was able to convince over 70% of participants that they committed a crime.
I think I just lost it. I couldn't take that anymore.
Okay. I was incredibly surprised at the rate that I had in terms of successfully implanting these false memories.
So, I always like participants speaking for themselves. There are a lot more of these participants, but those are the ones who gave me the rights to show their faces in places like this. If at this point, potentially, the idea, of course, is really just this incredible similarity between imagined experiences, especially when you get people to picture multi-sensory events, and that feels like a real memory, like a real lived experience. Often when I talk about this, the first response is, hopefully, if you believe me that this is possible, a bit of an existential crisis, which is indeed the sort of, who am I? How do I know what I am? How do I know my memories are mine? Could my whole childhood, for example, could it be all made up? Could what I did yesterday, could a crime that I never committed, could I really be convinced of that? And often people, when I ask, sort of saying, who here thinks that they would be vulnerable to this? People say, well, no. The participants in your study, they were young people. They were like 20 years old. I'm 30. This wouldn't happen to me. I'm not vulnerable or I'm not compliant. When you look at other studies, and you look at this study as well, and you find personality measures, you actually don't see significant differences between different kinds of individuals and how likely it is that they're going to form false memories. There is one, age does matter, but only in the sense that if you're a child, you're much more likely to go along with a situation, so you're much more likely to be compliant and say yes to things. But beyond that, it seems a natural and normal part of the brain. So probably yes, given the right, or if you will, wrong, interviewing method, given the right, or again, if you will, wrong, trust, someone could easily potentially convince you that you did something that is not even remotely in line with your personality. So my participants were all screened for never having had police contact to rule out the fact that they might draw on real memories. Now, there was, of course, a debriefing. There's an ethical process for all of this. Why do I do this? Do I just do this for fun, because I can? Someone asked me yesterday, is it just a fun party trick? Like, no, I don't do this at parties. That would be unethical. No, it's not just a party trick. It is, in fact, really critical to understand these things for the criminal justice system. Because if you have witnesses or victims or alleged perpetrators coming in and giving their statements, and when memory statements are the core issue within a case, the quality of that evidence becomes really important. And because false memories and real memories look the same when you tell them, I showed the videos of all my participants to new participants in another 2 samples, and I said, here's the same person recalling something that actually happened and something that didn't happen. Which one is which? And people couldn't tell the difference. So even for the same person, you can't tell whether that's their false memory or not. And so you need to show that this process is actually surprisingly easy to do. It doesn't require torture. It doesn't require some of the things that you might expect to force your brain into this kind of mold. And when you have this kind of evidence and take it into a courtroom, you can say, look, this particular memory, the process behind this memory is questionable. We need to be careful. The quality of this evidence is not very good. And given that when we talk about evidence in courts, we often talk about beyond a reasonable doubt. I know everywhere has a different term for this, but essentially, if it's bad evidence, you probably shouldn't be convicted, even if you're guilty, ultimately. It's a really nuanced issue. But in terms of memories, that's my role, and that's what I often do. So I go into courtrooms, and I say, this process, this interview process, was problematic, and so the outcome might be problematic. Now, another question I often get asked about false memories is, what does this have to do with digitalization? Aren't we all getting dumber and remembering less, is often what I get asked. Then there's something about millennials gets added to that, something about kids these days. And then there's often this conversation around kids, my children, often it will be like my child, is no longer learning facts because they know they can just Google it. Now that's a fascinating new reality that we live in, that we are already outsourcing significant parts of our memories. And not just that, we are gaining access to collective memories in a way that was never before possible. So we have access not only to our own and to other people's memories, but all the things that happen in between when those things collide. So what actually does happen? Are we getting dumber because we keep track of more things because we outsource remembering? Now, there isn't actually that much research on this, but there's one study that I really like that I think probably, actually there's two. Oh, let me tell you about both of them. They're totally different. I'll tell you about the first one with this slide and the second one with the next slide. Get excited. We love research, right? Yeah, science. So there was a study that had people remember, in this case, facts, so not autobiographical events. And they said, okay, you're going to spend the next hour learning these facts. And at the end, there's going to be a test. Now, a third of you, let's say, I would divide into a category where I say, you're just standard, you're just learning the facts, and that's it. Another third of you, I say, okay, it's not just about that you're learning the facts, you now also need to type them out. Another third, you're not just learning the facts, but you now need to sort them into folders. I give you 5 folders that have names that I've made up, and you need to sort these facts into these folders. But again, the task is still, you need to remember them. You just also need to sort. Now, for the people who did the normal remembering, they remembered significantly more than people who were asked to sort these facts into folders. But guess what the people who sorted things into folders remembered? They remembered which folder they were in. Now, what this is interesting, I think, for me, or what this shows potentially, is that we're changing how we remember things in the sense that we still need to remember the core idea behind a fact or piece of information. Because you can't go to Google and just say, tell me things. You need to type in keywords, you still need to know the concepts, and you need to remember them to do that. But the precise facts that are associated with those like what's the capital of Sweden? You only at this point really need to know that Sweden exists and that there's probably a capital of it. You don't really need to remember anything else. And so what this is showing is that potentially we're remembering better where things are stored than what the information actually is. But related to that, there's other research showing, I'll jump in one more study, that shows that if you are recording, so for those of you who are tweeting right now or taking pictures or videos, your brain is probably processing the moment differently where you're doing that than if you're not. Why? Partly because you're not paying as much attention. If you're paying attention to whether this photo looks good, you're probably not paying attention to the content. Oh. Okay. I get more time. Bonus time, that never happens. Do you like it so much? Sorry, where was I? Taking pictures and tweeting things. So twofold. So one is that you're probably paying less attention to the information that's happening in real time, which means back to the networks. You're probably not encoding your network as well as you would have had you not been distracted by whatever's in your hand, right? There's that, and then there's the other part of that, which is, again, the where you store things versus what the information is. As soon as you do that, you are more likely to tell your brain, I don't need to remember this because I've taken a picture. Now, that sounds like something that's scary, and the term that has been used for that is digital amnesia, which is that you record something digitally and your offline brain forgets it, but you could argue, but my online brain has it. And this is where actually I'm a big fan of you writing stuff down and taking pictures, but only if it's something you want to remember precisely and where multisensory stuff doesn't count as much. For example, if you really want to remember a quote, someone says a wonderful quote in a talk, you think, wow, that's really inspiring. How many times have you thought, I don't need to write that down? I'll remember that. It was so beautiful. 2 minutes later, oh my God, what was that quote? It's almost immediately gone. And if you do retain it, you often will alter it somewhat, even if it's a really short quote. So I'm a big, big fan of harnessing the technology that's in your pocket for things that you want to precisely store and remember, or things that are really important. And we'll get to that afterwards. Now, the other bit of this I want to tell you about, this is one of my other favorite studies, is a study about your online identity. Now, think about your profile picture for me for a second. Your profile picture, maybe you are on Twitter, again, we'll go back to that, Facebook, LinkedIn, I don't know, wherever you have a picture of your face and you're looking at it. Ideally online, doesn't have to be online even. Now, Do you think you'd recognize a picture of you if I took a picture of you right away, right now? If I took you onto the stage, took a picture of you, in general, you'd say, well, yeah, obviously I'd recognize a picture of me. Now, what if I change that slightly, and instead I say, go for coffee. I'm going to change your picture. I'm going to Photoshop your picture in 5% increments to be more attractive and to be less attractive. So now you're going to come back, and now I have 20 photos of your face, which is like most people's worst nightmare. I'm looking at 20 pictures of me. 20 versions of your face, and now I go, which one of these is you? Which one of these is not retouched? Now, what do you think you pick? Some people go, the most attractive. On average, people pick a photo that has been enhanced, indeed. They pick a picture that's about 15. I've been misquoted saying 50, not 50 for most of you. 15% more attractive than your face actually is right now. Now, you'd think your face being a pretty big part of your life, you do see it every day, probably part of your identity, why can't I recognize my face? One argument that was posited by the researchers who did this study was that perhaps we've tricked ourselves into believing the lie that we live online and in pictures, because which pictures do you put up online? Probably the ones that are about 15% more attractive than you actually are, possibly more. Now, the deviance in the study is also tremendous, so some people indeed picked one that's like 70% more attractive. Like, really? But there's a positive side here, which is that if you give that same spread to friends and family, and you say, which one of these is the original photo of your friend, they pick the right one. So you might be overconfident in your attractiveness, but your friends and family know what you look like, and they love you anyway. But I think this tells us a deeper narrative about how we present ourselves online and the repercussions that can have for our offline reality. Now, when we talk about memories, there's another interesting thing that happens. It's that because memories are these incredibly malleable networks, when you pull up a memory, what you're actually doing is you're making it malleable, you're making it flexible again. Not just that, but the person you're telling a story to, whether it's to a bot, to a human, you're writing a note, but probably you're telling the story to a human being, the way that human responds to what you're saying has a direct influence on what you're going to tell them and how you're going to remember it later. Now, you know this because we all know of stories that get better every time we tell them. And suddenly this story that started out kind of bland is an amazing story a year later because we've culled all the boring bits, because we pick up on social interaction and we like praise. And someone nodding and smiling and enjoying our story, that's praise. And so we modify our story every time a little bit. But this is the fascinating piece, is that there's research suggesting that when you pull those up, you don't have now a copy that's changed. No, you're putting down the changed version, and it replaces the original one. Again, one of the fascinating things about memory is that it doesn't seem to be that you have these multiple versions and you can go back and sort of undo, go to your time machine and go back to your previous edit. You can't do that in the brain. Your brain only has one version and it's overridden every time. So you need to be very careful and cautious with how you tell stories, who you tell them to, and just realizing that this is a thing that can happen. Now, the same thing can potentially happen with things like fake news. Say something often enough, it can become your new reality. Someone else telling you that, it doesn't have to be you telling it. If you're picturing these things, even if you had a lived experience, hypothetically, let's say, you were in an inauguration crowd of a president in, I don't know what country, some country, and maybe the crowd wasn't actually the biggest ever, but you were there. And someone shows you photos with all these big crowds of people, and it doesn't really matter that it was a different inauguration altogether. Because what can happen is that your memory can get replaced, and now all you're thinking about is those big crowds when you think about that event. This can happen, that's a sort of more extreme example, politically charged example perhaps. But this also happens in a more general sense. We curate our Facebook and online lives. You want to present yourselves a certain way online, and that's normal. But beware that what you're putting online, whether it's pictures or information, those things will likely be reinforced in your brain, and you will remember them better. And so if you're putting up things that are not actually that important to you, they might start to become things that are important to you. And if you're missing things, you're not going to have those in your offline or online timeline. And you're going to be more likely to forget things that might actually be more important to you that have less to do with image crafting. There's a quote that I like in relation to this. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be. From one of my favorite science fiction writers. I think this is absolutely true. That your online and offline identity, at this point, for one, I don't think there's a clear distinction anymore. I think you are your online identity. But I do think also that, keeping that in mind, the way you present yourself in that environment and how you craft yourself, that can become who you think you are. And not just who you think you are, but then who you are. So I think that that's a meaningful take-home message. Be conscious consumers of technology and realize that you are potentially hacking your own memories along the way. Now, this is where I used to stop, essentially. I'd say, okay, here's some problems, goodbye. And everyone would leave going, but what do I do with my memory? And I'd say, well, at least now you know that your memory is really flexible. But I've recently found a new research interest. And that research interest has to do with artificial intelligence. So about a year ago exactly, I was running around saying to people the absurdist statement, which was, I really still want to do something with memory because that's what I do, but I want to do something with AI. Now that is the most ridiculous statement because what does that mean? What do you mean you want to do something with AI? And I said, I don't know yet what it is, but I know there's something there. And about a year minus a week ago, I met someone who put me onto a new path, which is the co-founder of Evernote. Now, Evernote is a note-taking app, and the co-founder, Phil Libin, the tagline for Evernote is remember everything. And he's been really interested in this space of how do we use technology to help us remember better. And we got talking. And then 2 weeks later, I was in San Francisco. I'm not from San Francisco. I know I sound like it. I'm actually from Canada. It's also why I'm maybe in an even more privileged position to make fun of Trump. I don't know what I was talking about before. But I was in San Francisco, and I was talking to some people, and we were brainstorming these ideas, and it became clear to me that I want to be part of the solution. That especially for important emotional events, not for your whole life. God forbid you remember your whole life precisely. That would be awful. There is so-called highly superior autobiographical memory individuals, HSAMs. Now, these are individuals who have exceptional memory. They're the kinds of people who often have a diary, and you can ask, so 20 years ago, on February 12th, what did you have for breakfast? Or what was the weather? Or what happened in the news that day? And they will give you accurate answers. The kind of memories that most of us absolutely don't understand, including me. But they do this. And then when you ask them, however, do you think this is a superpower? Or do you think it's a super burden? What do you think they say? Almost all of them agree, this is not something I want to have. Now this brings us, before we get to the magical world of AI, this brings us to another subset of this. False memories sound like a mistake. They sound like an error. But they're not. Because the brain is intentionally flexible. The brain isn't there to remember precisely all the things that you've seen or done. The brain is there for abstraction and to orient you in the now. It's to manage what's happening right now, how do I survive this, and how do I plan for the future? And that same brain that is responsible for false memories effectively being a creative recombination of pieces of memories that already exist in the brain. False memories are normally real people, real places, real feelings, just put together in a way that never happened. But that exact same process is where you get creativity from, combining real pieces in a way that can't actually or doesn't actually exist. This is an essential part of being human. I would even say that false memories and intelligence are probably related to each other. Not in the sense that if you're more intelligent, you're more likely to create false memories, maybe. But I mean in the sense that the same process that allows one allows the other. So it's an absolute benefit. But sometimes, like when you witness a crime, or in my case of my aunt, don't witness a crime. When you witness a crime or experience something really emotional, sometimes you know this might really matter later. The precise details of this particular situation are important. Now it's the question is, how do I record it? What do I do? And I think this is where we get to Memory 2.0. We get to sort of the next step in our memory evolution, if you will. And so what I went on and did is I created an AI that helps you remember those important emotional events. And so the idea is that you have the perfect memory interviewer in your pocket. And if something happens, you can pull out your phone or pull out your laptop, and you have the perfect memory interview every time. And you don't need to understand the science of why it's the perfect memory interview. You just go do it, just like you would talk to a human being, except also there, it's better than a human being in the sense that you don't have to go find a human being and actually talk to them. Because in this day and age, at least, I feel like a lot of us actually prefer to text. We don't like to call. A lot of us prefer to be online. We don't like to meet up. And so this removes a lot of the barriers around access and around discomfort that might arise, especially when we're talking about important emotional events. So what is Spot? So Spot is the tool that I created. This is what it looks like. It follows what's called the cognitive interview. And the specific use case that we're applying it to is harassment and discrimination in the workplace. So the reason we're doing that is because if you build a cognitive interview bot, now that's the same technique that you teach police and military, that you teach good memory interviewers to use. The cognitive interview has about 20 to 30 years of research showing that it's a really good technique. Now, what happens if we automate this process? Because one thing about the cognitive interview that's really great for this kind of interface is it's a scripted technique. And guess what's really hard to do for humans? Sticking to scripts. You know what bots are really good at doing? Sticking to scripts. So one technique, one space in particular that I think this could be really useful is for helping you remember. So it essentially creates the perfect note. Because when you're stressed, when you've experienced harassment or discrimination, it's an emotional thing that happens. The best thing you can do is to make a contemporaneous record of what happened. But it's really easy there as well. Let's say you write yourself an email. Let's say you're James Comey, and your every day is an emotional experience. And you're recording all the things that have happened, and you're sending yourself emails with all the details to make sure they're time-stamped, because that's really important, right? To show I actually recorded this on the day. Even there, what do you put in the email? What details are important? How do you know what to include? And so this tries to walk you through a memory interview where at the end you can also ask other witnesses to use it. You can try and really build a case. And what you get out of it is a PDF that's outsourced remembering of this emotional event for you, keeps it as a contemporaneous record, and as I like to say, it turns your memory into evidence. Now, I think this is the future of at least part of remembering. Not just Spot, but I think things like this. I think that there's a lot to be said for using tools for things that they're really good at, for things that humans aren't as good at. It's not so much about recreating humans, it's about doing tasks better than humans. And I think this is one area where we can potentially succeed. And I think this is the first step that I've tried to create in the process of that. You can use it, by the way, it's free, it's online, talk to Spot. If you want to just play with it, go for it. If you have something that happened to you, go for it. We allow anonymous reporting to your employer as well. So you can send a PDF record to your employer through ours. It's free. We're not in the business of collecting data either. We'll be charging at some point, hopefully, all your employers to pay for the back end and management system of all this to make your workplace a better place. But for now, it's there and it will always be there. So let's say you don't want to use Spot. Let's say you don't believe in Spot. You're like, nope, don't trust it. There's lots you can do right now that has nothing to do with bots. I think the very best thing you can do, as I said, if you think there's something you want to remember, it doesn't have to be emotional. It's just something you really want to remember. Write it down. You have a phone in your pocket, record it, put it somewhere. Ideally, tag it with something so you can find it again. That's another thing that we struggle with, I know. And try to really record it contemporaneously. If it is something emotional, like a crime or like harassment or discrimination at work, send yourself an email. It's time-stamped. It matters. The amount of I have not been in a courtroom in the last 2 years where the issue of memory was raised, where people's Facebook Messenger messages weren't brought in as evidence. Your text messages, your Facebook messages, your emails, those are all timestamped pieces of evidence that get brought into the courtroom. There's a reason for that. Because a handwritten note, you can debate for days whether you actually wrote this on the day. With things like that, it's much easier to prove that this is contemporaneous. And so it becomes really valuable. Oh, sorry, going back. Hack your memory. So do that. Send yourself an email, record it, really try to think through all the pieces that might matter, including what other evidence you have. The other thing you can do, which is advice from so-called memory champions. So there are people who become memory grandmasters, kind of like in chess. They compete to remember as much as possible about names and faces and decks of cards, and they all use the exact same technique. Now, if we go back to those neural networks, we go back to the trying to create multisensory memories, all memory experts use the same technique to remember, for example, people's names, and it's to make as big a memory trace as possible. Someone introduces themselves and says, "Hi, I'm Julia." Most of us will, again, forget that information pretty much 30 seconds later, partly because we're distracted and we're not actually focusing on remembering that name. Instead, what you should be doing, if it's important to you, is think about something that goes with that name. Give that name texture, give it flavor, give it smells, give it colors. Try to make it as weird as possible. So maybe you know that Susan is Yvette. Maybe Susan is a big S for her name, and she's riding on a horse, and it's a supersized horse, and her hair is actually yellow because she's blonde, to help you remember that. And she's, I don't know. But the idea is to make big, complex scenarios effectively out of otherwise not complex information. And so that's the same technique they use for pretty much everything, is making these complex fragments that are easier to find later because they're bigger memory traces. If you're interested in that, well, I have a book that you can read called The Memory Illusion, but a much better book for learning about how to remember better is called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, who's a journalist who went on and within a year became a memory grandmaster. I'm going to leave you with this quote, which is that memory is like a Wikipedia page. It's constructive, it's reconstructive, you can go in there and change it, and so can other people. So again, be cautious with your memories, preserve memories that are important to you, and don't expect that you're going to remember something later just because it's important or emotional. Assume you're not going to. It's actually called overestimating your prospective memory. I'll remember that later. No, you won't. That should be the little Julia voice in your head afterwards. No, I won't. Write it down. Good. And here's how you can contact me. And I don't know if we do questions. 5 minutes for questions.
Thinking about doing maybe 10 minutes Q&A with you.
Sure. We're doing 10 minutes of Q&A with me on stage. Fantastic. Yay. So thank you very much.
Give her a warm round. That was a great presentation. Maybe if we could get 2 chairs. Can we get 2 chairs? Yeah?
We're not throwing off the schedule
I don't think we should ask Julia to stand for an hour. I mean, are you tired?
I don't mind.
Yeah? So talk to us a little bit, if you would, about this notion of memory as evidence. Because I was listening to your presentation, and it is interesting how easily our memories can be manipulated.
Yeah, so memories as evidence. So I like the idea of turning your memory into essentially an object that can be shared. So a digital object or a physical object, but a digital object that can be shared with others and that doesn't change.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean when I mean memory as evidence in terms of a unit of evidence.
Yeah.
But certainly what it does, because if you don't do that, then the social processes, so telling other people about it, hearing from other people who were there who experienced the same kinds of things, that can change and is likely to change how you remember that event.
All right.
I like to use a case where you have 10 different witnesses of the same crime, and those 10 people will have 10 slightly or maybe even very different stories of what happened. But if you put them in a room together, by the end of it, they will almost certainly have either exactly the same story each or mostly the same story each. And that's not necessarily because they've accepted all the correct information.
But that's if they compare stories, though, then they accept it, right? They accept each other's version.
Exactly. Well, they create this sort of amalgamate monster version, which may or may not resemble the accuracy.
Yeah. Do we have any questions? We've got one there. Do we have a microphone? There we go. We got a question here, and who else? We got this gentleman here. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, and nice talk. Would you propose some kind of Void-Kampf test to stick with a Blade Runner example to find out if some memories are tainted or not?
So God knows we've tried. It would be wonderful for criminal justice settings if you could identify false from real memories. There's a couple complications there. One is that, again, it looks like from neuroimaging technology that we have available now, and from the limited amount, to be fair, of research that's actually been done on neuroimaging in this space, but it seems that the networks they become memories. So there's nothing to detect, effectively. Sometimes people, along a similar vein, ask me, could you use a lie detector test? It's like, no, because they're not lying. They don't know it's wrong. That's the whole point. It's different.
Right.
And so there's no tells. And so there's been attempts at looking at what people are saying. Are they using first person? Are they using third person? The amount of details they're explaining, the chronology, sort of like the timeline of how things are going through. And some of those are good tells for deceivers, but they're not very good tells for false memories. So I'm not sure that a Voight test would work in this case.
What about if you wanted to try to find out from U.S. President Donald Trump if there had been collusion with the Russians during his campaign? Would it be possible to use let's say, a lie detector test there? Or would he not know that he was lying if indeed he were lying?
I mean, speculating about this is... Nobody's tweeting this, right? No. No, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what Trump would say. But one thing that adds to the complication of, even if we could detect false memories, is something that we often also see in the courtroom, which is that people have a mix of things that they know they remember and things that they've probably or certainly filled in. And so this is where your memories, it's not like they're 100% false or 100% true. They're often somewhere along a scale, like 5% false or 20% false. And that becomes really complicated then, because again, that person doesn't necessarily know that or doesn't know it.
Okay, we got a gentleman here.
What about the ladies?
Yeah, where are the ladies? There's a lady back there. You're next. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not a lady. But just a quick question. Could you talk a little bit about nostalgia in the context of false memories and what you think about that?
Question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've actually written about this topic. Again, this is like memory scientists like, let me help prevent Brexit. let me do something. So I wrote about nostalgia a couple times in relation to both Trump's Make America Great Again campaign and in relation to Brexit. Turns out my one article on the topic did not make much of an impact. But nostalgia is related to a bias that we have, which is called rosy reminiscence. And now this is, I mean, we all know sort of talk of the good old days, or the great old days, as now the rhetoric is. And the bias is, we all have this, especially actually over the age of 40. So there seems to be this curve that over the age of 40, when you look back at your youth and early 20-year twins, I guess, you have this fondness that you look back on that time with, and it feels like a better and more important time. And the reason that's often posited for why this is the case is that these are the times in your life that have defined your identity. So this is your first job, your first love, these are the sort of great first moments. And so they become really important to your life, which is right. But then you extrapolate that and say, so everything was great, and society was better, and we know what was right. So be very careful. So I've written about how false memories of the past can influence your voting about the future.
Okay.
I don't know what
we've got a question right back here. This woman, right, straight back.
Effectively, nostalgia, I think, is a combination of real memories, but also tainted by this false memory bias that makes us look back on our lives fondly.
Okay.
Hi. I actually wanted to ask about repressed memories, which are often related with traumatic incidents in our life. So, for example, if I were to talk to Spot and, there's a repressed memory, how does that work, for me to recall accurately what happened with the situation?
So for SPOT specifically, it's actually the place you would go if you know you experienced something. So you probably wouldn't uncover. It's not like therapy. You're not going to uncover anything in SPOT. But there's a couple things to unpick there. One is that memories of traumatic events are complicated, and that they do come in weird shapes and have weird repercussions, and obviously PTSD and sort of flashbacks, intrusive memories can be a big issue. But repression is actually a highly contentious issue. So the idea that you can completely repress a memory of something that's so big, effectively, and just not know it's there. There's a difference between not thinking about something for a long time and then having something trigger it, than, for example, being in therapy and saying, I'm depressed, and your therapist saying it's probably because you had a terrible childhood, and you going, I don't remember that. If that ever happens to you, which in Germany, by the way, is disproportionately high, beware if a therapist starts suggesting to you that your life was probably really terrible and you don't remember that. Be careful with that, because they might just start suggesting these things to you, and you might start going, oh my God, maybe it was really terrible, and you might accept that as your new reality.
Why do you think that's higher here?
Because German, so again, I'm half German, I work here a lot, ich kann auch Deutsch sprechen mit Ihnen, aber here it's psychoanalysis is really popular here. So Freud is still the king. And Freud, turns out, was not a scientific man and didn't really do very good research or any. And there's also been a lot of changes in our understanding of the brain since then.
Right.
So these concepts are a bit antiquated.
You believe then in the power of suggestion?
I see it happen, where things that absolutely could not have happened, people firmly believe did. And sometimes they're really terrible things that have really destroyed their lives. So you can walk in with depression and walk out with PTSD and depression.
Right.
Which, again, just be really careful with the therapist you pick.
This notion, I'm going to get back to this notion of nostalgia again. Why do we start to maybe long for the past once we hit 40? Is that because genetically we are programmed to die after we've hit 40? I mean, that's what used to happen, right?
I mean, not quite.
But I mean, our life expectancy used to be much shorter than it is now.
I think that's a really interesting I've never been asked that question. I don't think so. I think it's more that you have to have a certain amount of distance, or it's easier if you have a certain amount of distance from the events to misremember them. Okay. So if you were 20 yesterday, you're probably not going to have a nostalgia bias at 21, or the day you turn 21.
But what about personalities of people? You do meet 25-year-olds who seem to have an old soul and who actually find themselves longing for the time when they were 10. That happens.
It does happen, and that peak can be different. So I mean, of course, with these things, we're always talking about averages. So we're talking about sort of the general curve and the general trend, and especially with the nostalgia bias, what I really enjoyed spotting by accident was that the curve for the nostalgia bias maps on almost identically to the curve for voting patterns in the UK. Like, it's almost the same curve, which is kind of insane. But I think, people will have different biases towards different times. And again, maybe that was a particularly important time for you. And so you then package that in a world that was better.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. Any more questions? We've got two hands back here and a hand right here. Let's go to this woman right here.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your inspiring talk. Now I have a question. I'm working as a journalist. Memory is like the key for me, as it is for Brent Goff. And I experience it that when I publish an article, people keep calling me and say to me, no, they didn't say that. Yeah. And like, no, fuck, you said that. Yeah. And it's like accuracy. I really want to report the truth, but my memory tells me something different. And also why I'm here reporting from the CEBIT. And I think this memory is also or the app you invented is a good thing for us journalists. And I wanted to ask you if you have more projects to help journalists report the truth.
Very interesting point of view. Journalists often tune in. Journalists and people who write biographies often tune in as to how much of what I'm writing is actually fiction when I'm trying to write nonfiction. And I think that, you're absolutely right, that we will I think with quotes, I mean, I get this as well about my own stuff. I'm like, I wouldn't have said that. And then I hear the transcript or hear the interview. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I definitely said that. Because in my head, I'm of course going, but I didn't mean that, rather than I didn't say that. So there's that side. But there is also just, we're bad at precision. And so you will take out of an interaction different bits than I will. And that'll be based on all kinds of things, your biases, your worldview, what you find interesting. And that will then distort the other bits potentially, and you won't remember them as well, whereas those might be things that are important to me. But in terms of projects to help journalists, I mean, I think that writing things, I mean, already I meet a lot of journalists who use their iPhones to make sure they're actually recording an interview, which can help. At least then you have evidence. Look, this is what you said, whereas otherwise you just don't. But I think there's certainly applications for the cognitive interview chat interface, like what we created for Spot, for other things like journalism. Sort of what did they say, what happened, how did it happen, and also to interview people. So you could send that rather than being there in person, and they can spend as long as they need with this bot, including in things like conflict zones. Like you could send this to someone who's really far away and say, maybe you can just do this, and then send me the PDF. But for now, we're focusing on one use case and getting that really right, and that's workplace harassment discrimination.
Good. Okay, we've got some, they're all in the back for some reason. Raise your hands, hi. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned how maybe some people believe a crime they didn't do because of manipulating the memories. So is there any research about people who maybe are now in jail for that?
Yeah, there is. So the best source of cases for that is called the Innocence Project. There's another project in the Netherlands called Project Reasonable Doubt, which I think is a much better name because we have no idea whether people are innocent, but we do know whether they've been convicted based on bad evidence. But the Innocence Project, I think it's the innocenceproject.org, has, I think at this point, thousands of cases. They started with little cases, and they've grown into this massive space. And the only space that they use, actually, is that they go back in and look where DNA evidence existed, but they couldn't have used it at the trial because it was a long time ago, or they just chose not to use it. And then they take that forward and try to help exonerate people. But what they've found is that in 75% of cases where they believe a wrongful conviction has taken place, faulty eyewitness memory was part of that. So someone incorrectly, and probably not maliciously, not because they're trying to get that person into jail, but recalling a crime inaccurately. And 25% were related to false confessions. So 25%, of which some will probably have believed the confession that they're giving. Mm-hmm. So memory plays a huge role in miscarriages of justice, and there's some fascinating cases around that.
Okay, there is, okay.
A question on a level of details that we store in our, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. There you are, I see you.
Yeah. Level of detail that we store in our memories. I'm assuming our brain is doing a lot of map reduce, and it's just storing abstracts of actual concepts. So let's say I saw a red Honda, and then I actually remember more of an abstract concept of a red Honda instead of all the sort of visual information that would be extremely data inefficient. So I was wondering, what are your views on this topic?
Yeah, so that's called chunking. There's a name for that. And you're exactly right, is that, so a child might say, I saw a car. Then someone who knows brands of cars might say, I saw a Ford. Someone who knows particular models and has a particular interest in cars may say it was a Ford Pinto with a custom paint job. But for them, that's one piece of information. They see that car once, and that's there. They don't need to think about all those individual pieces. So they're storing one piece, where an amateur, is how we often talk about it, someone who's not an expert on that particular thing, stores 4 or 5 pieces, which is much harder. And so as we become better at tasks, as we become experts, and as we become better at being humans and communicating with each other, we chunk information more effectively. And that's why we can do more complex things and learn more effectively, because our memories are putting these into bits that then become one unit of information rather than many. So that's a whole process of learning. Yeah.
Chunking. Okay.
Chunking.
There's a gentleman here, and then we had someone in the very front row who has a question. And then I think we'll be done. You've been a good trooper.
We're overtime.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the experiment you did. So you implemented wrong memory. How did you delete the wrong memory they got?
It's a good question. It's an important question, in fact. So I often don't speak much about the debriefing because it's more interesting to some than others. But in the debriefing, at the end, I had them come back in, and I said, this is a false memory study. I actually videotaped that as well, and said, this didn't actually happen. And you can, if you don't believe me, because this is something I was worried about, and that did happen a couple of times, people said, no, but I remember it so clearly. What do you mean? And I said, no, I made it up. Well, I mean, effectively, you made it up, and I just gave you the framework to make it up within. But I then say, you can talk to your informant, you can talk to your parents, you can talk to the people I asked about this information. They didn't tell me this. But in essence, what happens with these memories, it seems, not just for these memories, but for memories like this, for false memories that all of us sometimes identify in our own stories, is that they don't necessarily go away. They just change in how we label them. So they turn into what are called non-believed memories. So they still kind of feel, I have non-believed memories. I have memories of meeting my grandfather that I know are impossible, but I still have them. They're still, when I think of my grandfather, I think of these fake memories. I just know that they're not true. And so I would hope that in this case, the participants would think of it as, oh, that was that study I did. And yeah, maybe I still occasionally think about it, but it has a different label. I did have a couple people identify themselves in my classrooms later on, so they would then take my class as a lecturer, and when I talk about this research, they would put up their hand and say, I was in that study, which is a great teaching tool. I can only recommend it. And then they'd say, no, this happened to me. And one person, I remember, Adam, you saw him. He was the guy. Adam was like, sometimes I still wonder. Do you know why? Why Adam still wonders? Adam chose as the person he attacked his childhood bully. In Adam's version of a fight with police contact, he finally stood up for himself, and he'd really quite like to keep that memory. So there's nuances around it, but there does seem to be this change in the process of how we label the memory.
Okay, one final question. This gentleman here was raising his hand.
Yeah, question is, could I convince my own memories that I did not commit a crime, though I did, and withstand a lie detector? So manipulating my own brain.
Lie detectors are pretty bad anyway, so you don't even need to convince yourself of that. But if you had a lie detector that had 100% accuracy, that always worked, which doesn't exist, let me just say that again. Let's say this existed. Probably is the answer. There's certainly been people who, again, are being involved in the criminal justice system. I've also seen people where, they then later admit to the crime, or there's overwhelming evidence that they did it. And yet there's definitely some people who, at least for periods of time, possibly forever, go, no, but I'm innocent. I didn't do this. Or I didn't do it in the way that people say I did. Or, classic, unfortunately, no, she gave consent. Right? So it's like pieces that are really, really critical, and really the whole case are about this piece of information, but they convince themselves that that piece was different than it probably actually occurred. So yes, I think that telling yourself you're innocent often enough can make you believe that you are innocent.
Excellent. Well, Julia Schall, thank you very much. That was a great talk. You were a great trooper for going for an hour, too. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.